Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Nextier and welcome to Development Discourse. Our purpose for putting together this event to create a platform for us to explore and share ideas on some of the more difficult development challenges we face as a nation, in the hope that we get the right people in the room and that we can all wrap our heads around these big challenges and come up with some pragmatic solutions. We're really excited with the topic for today, because following the presidential elections and the violence that was part of that election, we felt it was a good time to attempt to unpack this very difficult issue that's been with us for some time, identity politics. It's not unique to Nigeria, but it's one of those issues we shy away from discussing. And today what we hope to achieve with this discussion is to properly situate the challenge, hear different points of view from the people in the room, and then point to certain vistas of how we can begin to deal with this really big challenge. Nextier is a public sector, public policy consulting firm. We are really interested in a number of verticals. Governance happens to be one of them, security and conflict, the power sector, petroleum, and some work in agriculture. We also have Credo Advisory that focuses on strategic communications, especially how governments communicate with the citizens to implement policy. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our presenter for today. Chris Ngwodo is a partner at Salem Advisory Services. He's also the author of Fate of the Union, and his presentation over the next 20 to 25 minutes will be to share with us the ideas contained in the book. Following that conversation, his presentation, Miani Buka will join him on stage, and we'll have about 25 minutes moderated discussion, and then we open it up to the audience. We would like to appeal that when we get to the audience participation, we keep comments or questions to 1 minute so we can get to many people in the room, which means that as we sit, let's think through what it is we want to contribute and keep it to about a minute. Last comment I'm going to make is please kindly tweet at Nextier SPD, which is organizing this event today. We'll invite you to join us on roadmapnigeria.org, where over the next 2 weeks, we would like to have real in-depth conversations around identity politics, and all of that would lead to a communique of some sort that will go to the people in power who should really be leading on this conversation. So without much ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Ngwodo.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. My name is Chris Ngwodo. I'm a writer. Most of my work revolves around governance, public policy, security, development, and all of that. In the last 15 years, I became interested in how issues of identity and identity politics frame conflict situations in this country and how we respond to them. I became interested in how identity is, as it were, the primary lens through which all events in our country, all events in the public space are perceived and analyzed. And as a result, this book is a product of that interest. So in the next few minutes, what I want to do is to give an overview of some of the ideas in the book, some of the propositions in the book. So in the next few minutes, I want to give an overview of some of the propositions in the book. The presentation, I should tell you ahead of time, it will not be exhaustive. Naturally, I want you to buy the book, so I can't tell you everything that is in the book. But I will set out a few big ideas or not so big ideas, some obvious, fairly obvious things that I think are in the book, and hopefully we will have a fruitful conversation. So going straight to the statement of the problem. I don't think there's any Nigerian alive who thinks about Nigeria or who engages with Nigeria that has never heard this statement before. A statement by Obafemi Awolowo from his book Path to Nigerian Freedom, which was written in 1947. If there is any singular event, or rather singular statement that probably prompted me to write, it's probably this statement. Because I find that in my engagements about Nigeria, about its viability, about its possibilities, this statement is often quoted, mostly out of context, mostly incompletely, but very urgently in a way that sort of is meant to nullify the conversation about Nigeria's viability or Nigeria's prospects. So the moment you start talking about Nigeria, what Nigeria can be, what it can do, you know, any discourse on nation building almost, you face someone that drops this statement. Nigeria is a mere geographical expression, as Awolowo said, and then mic drop and then walks away like that's supposed to have killed the conversation. And I decided to interrogate the statement. I looked for the book. I wanted to have the full context. I wanted to understand what he meant. And the more I interrogated it, the more I felt the need to write. So this to me is the statement of the problem, because I think the statement is very problematic. I think that this is one of probably the most damaging statements, possibly because of the way it's used, I think, mostly because of the way it is used, but also because in the first instance, it is not even an accurate statement. And that is, for me, the point of departure when we begin to engage issues of identity politics in Nigeria. So he says Nigeria is not a nation, it is a mere geographical expression. There are no Nigerians in the same sense as there are English or Welsh or French. The word Nigerian is merely a distinctive appellation to distinguish those who live within the boundaries of Nigeria from those who do not. There are various national or ethnical groups in the country. It is a mistake to designate them as tribes. Each of them is a nation by itself. Now, I think the core premise, when you try to reduce this to its bare bones, what he was essentially proposing was that ethnic homogeneity is the basis of modern nationhood, or is the basis of nationhood, period. So in his view, Nigeria was a country of 250 nations that had been forcefully cobbled into one nation. But his central proposition from this statement is that ethnic homogeneity is what makes nations, and that is simply incorrect. Ethnic homogeneity is not the basis of modern nationhood, it's not the basis of modern nation statehood. Less than 30% of the world's nations, probably lower, are ethnically homogeneous. So to say, for example, that a nation can only be a nation if it is composed of one singular group, if it is composed of a homogeneous group, it's simply inaccurate. So that is the first problem I had with the statement. Most nations are ethnically diverse. Nations that appear to be homogeneous today appear that way only because of years of building social cohesion, years of painstaking work in forging those differences into one singular umbrella identity. And I think somewhat to make matters worse, he compared us to the French. Familiar with the history of France, you will see that it was really, the making of France is the story of how an elite in Paris forcefully colonized the rest of France and submitted it or subjugated it under the rule of Paris. At the time of the French Revolution, less than 12% of France spoke French. So the French project, the making of the nation state of France, has been a story of how Parisian elites sublimated all other identities and all other languages under the umbrella of French. The French identity is a constructed identity. So that is the first problem with this statement, and it is just that to say that it is a factually incorrect statement. Flowing from that is something I call the myth of Nigerian exceptionalism, which is to propose that just because of Nigeria's colonial provenance, it is somehow unique, it is somehow different, it is somehow a freak of geopolitics and history, that there's just something different. And I'm sure that everybody here must have been in some conversation or the other where somebody says, but you know, this is Nigeria, or you know, because the colonialists did something, or because Lord Lugard did something. And it has fed a very toxic sense of exceptionalism among us. I believe it is toxic because it detracts from us. It saps us of the will and the energy to constructively engage the problems that we have. It feeds a false idea that Nigeria is unique in a very negative sense, when in actual fact it is not unique in any way at all. There is not one problem, not one social, political, or economic problem that Nigeria is currently experiencing that other countries have not experienced, or which some are not experiencing. Yet the idea of Nigerian exceptionalism continues to paralyze us. It has foisted a kind of moral and intellectual paralysis on us when it comes to engaging problems creatively. The core premise, therefore, is that on account of our colonial provenance, Nigeria is somehow unique, it is somehow unworkable, it is fundamentally illegitimate. Again, I disagree strenuously with this. First of all, Nigeria is not unique because it was created by colonialists. Several countries were created by colonial will. Different countries have been colonized throughout their history. England itself was colonized. Australia was colonized. Canada was colonized. There is absolutely nothing unique about Nigeria's colonial provenance. But the other idea being that the country, because it is a colonial creation, because it was forcefully brought together, as they say, it is also fundamentally illegitimate and unworkable as a result. This is simply false. Colonialism is a fact of history. And what colonialism did in Nigeria was that it interrupted local imperialism that was ongoing. So for example, I would say to you that if British imperialism had not happened, Oyo imperialism and Sokoto imperialism would simply have filled that gap, and in many respects they did, right up to the time that the British came. So this idea that the problem of Nigeria is that it is a creation of Western imperialism, as though imperialism is something synonymous with the West, and which is not something that we've been doing, is again simply false. So we move to deconstructing identity politics in Nigeria. My proposition here is that I know that we live in times of polarization. And when Patrick first told me about this event, he said, you know, we live in very polarizing times, you know. And I said, okay, sure, whatever you say, we live in polarizing times. But to be very honest with you, I think that if you cast your mind back, and there is a part of the book that actually talks about this, Nigeria always lives in polarizing times. This debate, I hear people say things like, we've never been this divided. I am not sure. We fought a civil war. We are not fighting a civil war now. I know that we tend to garnish our analysis with superlatives. So the crisis of the moment is always the worst crisis. But if you think back, I mean, 40, 50 years ago, there was a civil war. There's no civil war right now, you know. There were particular incidents that I think provoked, you know, the necessity of this event. But this idea that we are polarized now more than ever, I don't want to trivialize or belittle the gravity of the moment, but what I would suggest to you is that this is what we do all the time. And if you're familiar, if you take reports, news reports around election season, around every election cycle, you will find the same tenor of worry, anxiety, paranoia For as long as I can remember, Nigeria has always been on the verge of breaking up. It's always falling apart. It's always falling to pieces. We are always on the precipice. The world is about to end. And I think that, I do not mean to trivialize the issues. I'm simply saying that if we acted like we were not living inside a 24-hour news cycle and simply cast our mind back over the broad sweep of history, we would have the same conversation we have all the time. After every election, the world is coming to an end. Before every election, the world is coming to an end. The heavens are falling. We will go our separate ways. It's very boring if you are historically conscious. It's very boring. It is terrifying if you live in a 24-hour news cycle, but it's also a bit boring. That being said, because it happens all the time does not mean that it does not have a meaning. It speaks to something fundamental. And I want to interrogate those things that are fundamental in the way we've constructed identity that makes our politics so laden with, anxiety and pathos and hypertensive, angst all the time. So one of my big propositions in the book is that Nigerians are not in fact as divided as we insist that we are. I argue that if we were as divided, if we were viscerally as divided as we assume we are or as we insist we are, there would be no country by now. I think that what is going on and that we have to understand the nature of the polarization in our society in two ways. Prejudice and convergence are fundamental aspects of the human condition in any society. In other words, when you have a plural society and when you have a society that is diverse, you will also have a measure of prejudice within that society, whether you call it bigotry or racism or tribalism, religious extremism, chauvinism of any kind. You will find them in plural societies. There's absolutely nothing unique about that. What is unique in the Nigerian situation is where chauvinism, where those negative indices, as it were, begin to inform state policy and begin to inform public policy. So I will say to you, for example, that in social terms, over the last 50 years, over the last 60, 70 years, over the last century, the forces of integration have been at work in our society. The forces of convergence have been at work in our society in social terms and in economic terms. What does that mean? I mean that people are going to get up from where they are. Nobody is going to starve to death in a place that is not viable because he feels an overwhelming sense of loyalty to a patch of earth. He's going to leave his village or his state or his city and move somewhere else in the country to a place where they do not speak his language, do not share his faith, and the people are not largely of his ethnicity. He's going to go there in search of a livelihood. I'm saying to you that you will find that over the last 40 years, over the last 50 years, the rate of inter-ethnic marriages has increased in this society. Right? I know that it doesn't sound like a conversation where you bring up romantic issues, but romance is very important for nation building. Right? So there are forces of integration at work in our society. However, our politics remains governed. The political economy that we've created is one that has constructed identity as the key of access to social and economic opportunity, particularly opportunities mediated in the public space, mediated by the state. So, for example, these things that what we colloquially call the indigent settler dynamic or the indigent settler dichotomy, in practice, how it works in many states in this country is that if your state of origin, I think that's probably a better word, if you belong to a certain state of origin, to access public sector opportunities such as education and employment, you're favored over people that do not come from the state. So the political economy creates a system of apartheid, creates grades of citizenship, as it were, and so constructs one group as settlers or non-indigens who have a lesser claim to opportunities in the public space within that state from those that it considers indigens or sons of the soil. Now, what this does is that because it makes identity the key of access to social and economic opportunity, it makes identity something that can also be politically weaponized. It makes it impossible to have a rational conversation about common citizenship because in the first place, having constructed identity in that way The nation is not made up of compatriots, it's made up of competitors, people that see themselves as competitors. So that the idea that you encounter subliminally and overtly at every point is that in order for you to have something from the government, somebody else belonging to some other faith or some other ethnicity or some other state must lose something. It's a very zero-sum dynamic, and I find it grossly damaging to the possibilities of national cohesion. So that to me is the reason why, or the central reason why you have discord and division. I am proposing that the politics itself, the nature of the politics itself, generates discord. The discord we see is not an aberration. It's an entirely logical consequence of the way the political economy has constructed identity. Outside of the public spaces, I'll suggest to you that for the most part, people get along okay. Outside of the political space, outside of the public space, outside spaces not governed by the state, outside spaces where the allocation of reward is not refereed by the state, I would suggest to you that Nigerians get along generally okay. But bring Nigerians into a room where the rewards are being refereed, the allocation of rewards are being refereed by the state, and the dynamic changes completely. The understanding of the issues at stake changes completely. It moves from being a question of opportunity to being an existential issue, where Nigerians begin to perceive themselves on account of whether the differences in ethnicity or religion as existential threats to each other. Naturally, this leads to a fracturing of the public realm. I would say to you that most of the things we describe as ethnic and religious conflicts, without downplaying the importance of identity in a plural society, are actually distributional conflicts within the context of Nigeria. There are conflicts about the allocation of resources, there are conflicts about the allocation of spoils of politics, there are conflicts about just the allocation of reward in the Nigerian state. But since the 1970s, Nigeria's population has quadrupled, but our economy has remained a mono-resource economy. Essentially, the contents of the pot have shrunk, but the mouths meant to feed from that pot have exponentially increased. So there is a way in which the dynamics of identity politics become more amplified and more toxified in the climate or in the context of resource shrinkage. And even if we were to take that premise just simply literally, one of the current conflicts we are dealing with within our country now, which involves two different economic classes, farmers and herders, is directly related to the disappearance of the one resource that is common to both economic classes, which is actually arable land. So that is an example of how identity can become even more weaponized in the context of resource shrinkage. Now, just so that I'm not sounding too highfalutin, I think if I use the example of a polygamous household, in times of abundance, polygamy looks like a fantastic idea, especially for the man. However, in times when abundance is no longer happening, in times of scarcity, in times of shortage, people begin to position themselves more because they are seeking privileged access to rapidly diminishing resources. So within that household, the children of the first wife become important. It becomes important to be, if your mother is the first wife, it becomes very, very important. It becomes an existential issue at that point because the resources are diminishing. Now that's a crude example, but I think it will suffice for what I'm trying to pass across. One of the ways in which economics has distorted or has shaped identity politics in this country, I would say that when we discuss identity in Nigeria, we are talking about three axes. We are talking about class, we are talking about religion, and we are talking about ethnicity. My book deals primarily with ethnicity, which I argue is a social construct, but I think we will discuss that later on. In the mid-1980s, a combination of things had happened by that time. We had maxed out on our oil boom. There was the introduction of the structural adjustment program. And one of the unforeseen or unintended consequences of that policy was the destruction of the industrial base of northern Nigeria. What it did was that it wiped out an entire blue-collar working class and cast families into destitution. Without going into the specifics, I will propose to you that you cannot really begin to interrogate issues of the rise of religious extremism in northern urban centers without interrogating the destruction of the blue-collar working class in those areas. If you go around Kaduna, Bauchi, Kano, what you will find are deserted ghost towns, huge, massive industrial estates that simply were left deserted and cast an entire blue-collar working class into the abyss of destitution. If you also understand Nigeria's dependency ratio, which is quite astronomical, you understand that for every one person that loses a job in this country, you've imperiled probably 20, possibly 30 people. Those are the kind of dynamics we are looking at. So you cannot interrogate the issues of religious extremism without understanding the impact of socioeconomic upheavals in the 1980s, that occurred in the 1980s. I'll go further to suggest to you that prior to the 1980s, the primary axis of conflict in northern Nigeria was more ethnic than religious. Religious conflicts became normative features of that region starting from the late 1970s. And there are a number of reasons why that happened, ranging from the influx of Saudi money, propping up different strains, very radical and ultra-conservative strains of Islam, to just the economic downturn that wiped out an entire working class. The point is that economics matters to the way identity is constructed in a society. And because when we have these conversations, one of the problems we have in these conversations is that issues of identity in the global context have somehow are somehow made synonymous with the African condition. So for example, you often get the idea that tribalism, things like tribalism are uniquely African problems, you know, owing to our stage of development or whatever. But I'll tell you that, for example, if you're following contemporary news about Brexit, Brexit is very much, in one sense, you could think of Brexit as a chauvinistic reaction to the economic state, the economic crisis, the economic catastrophe that has befallen parts of northern England. You will find a correlation between those that voted for Brexit and the collapse of industries in northern England. You will find that by comparison, the places in England that voted to remain are places that are largely considered to be cosmopolitan, places that are largely considered to have benefited from globalization. But because one of the impacts of globalization is in the pursuit of places with lower production costs, you will find that jobs move from places to place, and certain jobs are more vulnerable than others. You have a deindustrialized belt of communities in northern England. Those places you will find voted predominantly for Brexit. So as I said, what looks like an identity conflict sometimes is simply how people are reacting to economic adversity. If you go back to the 1970s and 1980s, you will find that I think we remember it now as Ghana Must Go. We remember it now as Ghana Must Go, but it was really a time of xenophobia in our own society where we were convinced that the problem with Nigeria was aliens, Ghanaians, Nigerians of whatever hue, and we expelled them from our country. These are ways in which you have the construction of identity is shaped by economic forces and economic circumstances. I'm going to just rush through now because apparently I prepared too much for this presentation. Hopefully we will cover other things. We will be able to cover other areas. I'll say to you that my biggest challenge with identity politics is that it is a clear and present danger to social cohesion anywhere, especially the way in which we practice it. I'll say to you that wherever identity politics predominates, one of the reasons why I think, for example, our country continues to have chronic violence is that wherever identity politics predominates, there is no value, there is no regard for human life, there is no regard for the human individual. The rights of the individual do not matter because the public space does not conceive of the individual in the way, for example, that liberal democracies conceive of individual rights. Where identity politics predominates, people are not seen as individuals. They are seen as units or they are seen as components of a broader ethnic unit. So the individual has no value in and of himself. He only matters because he is part of a group that is either deemed to be superior or deemed to be the enemy at any given time. In those situations, the doctrine of categorical extermination reigns. What does categorical extermination mean? What it means is this, that for the sin or the crime of one person, an entire group that is deemed to belong to can be attacked, either by the state or by non-state actors. This has happened often enough in our history. A fractured state with weak institutions cannot guarantee human rights or secure life and property. Under these circumstances, what we call tribalism, sometimes the manifestations of tribalism that we see are actually ways in which people are seeking social security. So, for example, for those of you that live in segregated cities, for those of us who live in segregated cities like Jos and Kaduna, one of the reasons why segregation happens is that after each bout of violence, victims or survivors of that violence saw the perpetrators of the violence walking around freely in the same neighborhood and realized that they couldn't live in the same community with these people, and they sought security and sameness. In security, in sameness of creed or sameness of kinship. So you find that in Jos, for example, there are places that are predominantly Muslim, where I, as a Christian, past a certain time, I should not be found in those places. By the same token, there are parts of Jos that are predominantly Christian, where if you are a Muslim, you know better than to venture into those places. The same could be said of Kaduna. These are reactions to the failure of the state, the failure of a fractured state to guarantee the human rights of everybody, to secure life and property, and more importantly, to see people as citizens rather than as units of ethnic categories, the case may be. I think because of time, I'm going to just go straight to the last place, the last page. The question, therefore, to ask, that we ask, because I've heard this said several times, it goes back to the idea of delegitimizing the country, delegitimizing Nigeria. Is Nigeria a criminal enterprise? This is a question that speaks to legitimacy. And I've heard this asserted several times, that one of the reasons why Nigeria is unique is because it is a criminal enterprise. The state is a criminal enterprise. And to that, what I would say is that all nations start out as criminal enterprises. All nations start out as criminal enterprises. You have a bunch of people that emerge and begin to extort people. Essentially, that is what we describe as taxation now. Begin to extort people for protection. And we would call it, in modern terms, we would describe it as a protection racket. But what is the difference between, let us say, Boko Haram, for example, taking over parts of the northeast and extorting or collecting taxes from people in return for protecting them, and the Nigerian state taking taxes from people in return for protecting them? That's a big way of thinking about issues of legitimacy. So all nations start out as criminal enterprises, but what happens is that over time, the elites of that society legitimize the state by creating a social construct and creating an elite consensus that essentially provides an umbrella of protection for all the citizens. My submission to you is that we are at a point in our country where we must begin to forge that elite consensus, a new one, a more inclusive elite consensus. We're at a point in our country where we must also create a proper social contract that guarantees the Nigerian citizen, that gives the Nigerian citizen a minimum of expected deliverables from the state, and also outlines what he can reasonably believe his securities to be as guaranteed by the state. One of the quotes here, I think, is worth saying. Remove justice and what are kingdoms but gangs of criminals on a large scale? And what are criminal gangs but petty kingdoms? This goes back to the issue of legitimacy. The issue of legitimacy matters a great deal because we've just come out of a very fractious election cycle. And I've realized that for Nigerian elites, there's a lot of stock placed on winning elections and the acquisition of raw power, but there's not a great deal of conversation or thought about the idea of legitimacy. In other words, what I'm saying is that it is quite okay for somebody to win an election and become president. But the question of legitimacy speaks to the issue of governability. When you become president, can you in fact govern?
How many people? These are issues of legitimacy, and legitimacy is framed by how people perceive the propriety of the means by which power is acquired. I think that this is a particularly important aspect of this conversation, because part of the issues that we are dealing with in Nigeria today is not just the culture of violence or ethnic conflict. We are dealing with challenges rooted in a fundamental belief that the Nigerian state is not legitimate. And so when you go to places where you have armed non-state actors usurping functions of the state, that is, it's not enough to call it banditry or criminality or even terrorism. You're looking at the formation of parallel states. Or at the very least, you're looking at armed groups that have aspirations towards some kind of statehood, towards usurping the state. And I think that that is a development that should give us pause. Thank you very much. I will end
Permit me to invite Miani Buka, who is the governance lead at the Policy Advisory, who wrote a very important piece, The Challenges of Identity Politics, Identity in Nigeria's Political Economy.
My job is very, very simple, is to carry on the conversation, but this time make sure we don't only listen to Chris, but listen to each other as we delve deeper into the various angles and themes and ways that he has explored these issues. Sort of a breakdown of how this conversation is going to continue has been shared, I think, to everyone in Little Slip. What I'll do is, for the next couple of minutes, I will just ask Chris a few questions. Now, the module we have is I would spend the next 30 minutes doing that, but I think after listening to Chris, there's no point to you guys just listening to us for another 30 minutes. So I will ask a question, take a question or two from the audience, and then come back and interject with another question from those that I have together. That way it's a lot more interactive. I'm standing because my voice is very hollow. I thought that it's a big joke by NEPA or whoever that just when I was about to come up, the microphone doesn't exist. So if you can't hear me very well, blame it on Patrick and this elite that we continue to blame for most of our interactions. But my first question is, Chris, somewhere in your presentation, you said ethnicity is a social construct, and then said, we'll talk about it a little more later. So now it's the later. If you can delve a little into that, and just a little background as to why I think it's an important point to start off with. On the average, when Nigerians meet anywhere in the world, we introduce ourselves to each other, and imagine someone says, my name is Ali Usman Chukudi, and the other says, my name is Adibola Bayo. The most likely first thing that would happen would be that Adibola Bayo would be confused, because Aliu Bello Chidi is confusing this other person. Why is your name Aliu, which sounds like you're from somewhere in the north, and another name Bello, which also sounds like that, but then there's Chidi. So now I don't know what to do with you. Are you Igbo? Are you Northern? Are you Christian? Are you Muslim? And of course, if you're not Christian or Muslim, you really don't exist in Nigeria, so we apologize. No one thinks, is it Christian or Muslim or Buddhist? No, we just think, are you Christian or Muslim, and it stops there. And it speaks to how strongly we self-define and identify one another based on ethnicity and, to an extent, religion as well. So ask an average Nigerian or an average, whatever, yeah, Nigerian. who are you? And you'll say their name, and they'll start talking about where they're from, which is most instances is what village their father can trace their origins to. Not necessarily where they're from. They may have been in Lagos for 22 years, Jafar Bukar, and their father says, you know, we really came from Borno. And you say, well, my name is Jafar Bukar, I'm from Borno State. He's been in Lagos 22 years. And so the idea is that in our interactions, we treat our ethnicity as very, very static. It starts from our parentage, and we carry it with us for the rest of our lives. So I thought it was interesting that I said it's really a social construct, meaning it's very malleable, and it is artificial, and it can change. So in explaining that, what I want you to explore is, are you saying, in other words, that ethnicity can change, a person's ethnicity can change in the course of their lifetime?
These other identities that we have, the component identity. So being Idoma is more legitimate, more real, more authentic than being Nigerian. So ethnicity is position, which is a subset of Awolowo's argument. Ethnicity is positioned as something that has inherently superior legitimacy to the nation state or to the national identity. My argument is that all identities are artificial. All identities are constructed, whether the identity of the nation state or the identity of the tribe or the ethnic group. They are all social constructs. They emerge by the will of man. So for example, saying Nigeria is a geographical expression is a bit meaningless because all nations are geographical expressions, right? So to that extent, all ethnicities are constructed. They emerge in time. They are not received from heaven. I'll go further to assert that none of the major ethnicities that we talk about in Nigeria today existed 150 years ago. So for example, there was never a Hausa collective. There was no Hausa racial or ethnic collective. The Hausa society, the Hausa civilization existed as a bunch of city-states that most of the time were warring against each other, but more importantly, in terms of self-definition. 150 years ago, you were from Zaria, you were from Katsina, you were from Kano. That was far more important than belonging to a broader Hausa umbrella, which quite frankly did not exist at that time. It wasn't until the coming of the colonialists that term, that collective, that civilization became increasingly synonymous with the idea of a north, a northern Nigeria, for example. Same could be said of the Yoruba people, same could be said of the Igbos, for example. These groups were never conceived as collective. The way we understand them, which is the irony, because if usually somebody says to you, then you know Nigeria is a colonial creation, and they come back to that event, so is being Yoruba, so is Igbo, and so is Hausa. These are all colonial creations. Outside of colonialism, it is unlikely that you would have had any of these groups. So in understanding that these groups, if all groups are artificial, then we are not all, if all identities are social constructs, then what we are debating is not the inherent legitimacy or superiority of one to the other. We are simply having a conversation about how you mediate the potential for tension between them. In other words, as in the early 20th century, there was a debate in Germany whether it was possible to be Jewish and to be German. So now there is a debate in many respects in our society. It is possible to be Idoma or Fulani or Igbo or Hausa or Yoruba or whatever and be Nigerian at the same time. And it is an entirely reasonable debate. But where it cannot start from is the idea that one identity supersedes the other. Because as I've just pointed out, and this is borne out by history, these groups did not exist. Going beyond that, you will find that if you look at the broad sweep of history, if you go back 1,000 years, the US did not exist, Canada did not exist. Go back 1,000 years and nation states didn't even exist. So we've moved from a place of hunter-gatherer society to tribes, to city-states, and ultimately we've now landed at the place of the nation state. Who's to say that this is the final endpoint in geopolitical evolution? It's not clear. Because 10 years ago, the sentiments in Europe was towards creating a European superstate. That was the ultimate destination of the European Union. But now you're having a resurgence of nationalism. So there is a way in which, I remember I said that we mustn't be too obsessed, too submerged in the panic and the crisis of the moment. If you go back 20 years, there was a resurgence of nationalism after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Trump's motto, America First, is not even original to him. It was first used by Pat Buchanan. I'm not even sure he was the first person, but Pat Buchanan ran in the 90s. The point is that you find trends in societies that repeat themselves for a variety of reasons over the course of time. So it can happen over 20 years, it can happen over 30 years. But the point is, things like ethnicity are not static. So 100 years ago, 150 years ago, a man that would have been content to call himself Ekiti or Ijebu now calls himself Yoruba. It will become increasingly important to call yourself somebody from the southwest. If you look at Nigerian political discourse over the last 40 years, so 40 years ago we simply referred to, if you came from above the Niger, you were simply a northerner. That was all to it. In fact, you were not only a northerner, potentially you were Hausa, or Hausa Fulani, which is even worse, you know. So, Hausa Fulani is a perfect example of the artificiality of identities. Because anthropologically, there is no such identity.
Yes.
Hausa Fulani is a political construct, it's a socio-political construct. Hausa and Fulani, the Hausa and Fulfude, the two languages, do not even belong to the same language. In fact, in many respects, linguistically, Fulfude is closer to Igbo than it is to Hausa. But because of the context of our evolution, the context of our history, it became convenient for a group to define itself in this way. All of these are products of historical circumstances, not biology and not genetics. So I think that the idea I'm trying to pass across here is, yes, identities are artificial, all identities are artificial. Ethnicities are not only artificial, they are malleable. And if you will permit yourselves to speculate a bit, I know that we obsess with internal incoherence, our internal incoherence and dysfunction as a country. But when you see the passion Nigerians reserve for jollof wars or by being insulted by other Africans, you begin to realize that there might be something to this Nigerianness, right? But maybe 70 years from now, 80 years from now, it will not be fashionable or even meaningful to call oneself a Nigerian. A West African identity might have emerged. That is how these things happen. So, in a nutshell, the point is ethnicities are dynamic. Identity, rather, is dynamic, not static. And identities are also malleable. So, I am not what my grandfather was, and my grandchildren will not be what I am currently. We have to think of identity in those terms. I think one of the drivers of conflict in our society is that against every law of human history, migration, and evolution, we've insisted in keeping people, holding them, making them captives of geography and genetics in this country. And I think that one of the ironies of our situation is a Nigerian can live here, go and have a child abroad, knowing fully well that just by having that child abroad, the child becomes a citizen, then can return here to declare that some people are sons of the sun and others are not sons of the sun. It's completely ridiculous. So I think that some of these contradictions need to be interrogated further if we are going to make progress as a country.
One more question, then I'll ask to me more and more that at the core of the various strands of thought captured in your book is not so much identity as a problem. So identity in and of itself isn't the challenge. It's managing identity within the political space, within the public space, and very importantly, what that means for economic opportunities. And then maybe lastly, also, which you just referred to in the last comment you made, the tie between identity, or in this case ethnicity, and citizenship. So I do know that, for the sake of keeping the conversation easy, one can say if every one of us here is likely asked the question, how do you determine or how do you identify your ethnicity? Or your identity, you immediately say, well, my father is from this place. And first of all, there's a part where I find personally amusing. No one ever says my mother is from this place, always as a second thought. Meanwhile, if you look at Section 10 of our Constitution, where the word indigenous is mentioned and it's thrown us into this indigenous, non-indigenous thing, it says that a citizen of Nigeria is a person for whom one of their parents is of an ethnic group indigenous to local government Nigeria. Nowhere is it said their father. So there's also a sexism to it that it's not a subject matter and you explored, but an issue that in my personal thinking I've been concerned about. But to go back to the main question, ethnicity, identity, and citizenship, and what you just said, how it's possible for someone, say, who is Fulani to go to Texas and have a child who is from Texas and Fulani, but the person cannot go to Lagos and have a child who is from Lagos and Fulani. How do you just dismantle the two? It seems to me citizenship is a very strict, artificial, political construct that speaks to the relationship between an individual and the state and the nature of the social contract that emerges. Whereas identity or ethnicity speaks to more a deeper question of how a person chooses to deal with questions of who they are existentially and how they self-define. Now in Nigeria, we have built one on the other. Do you think that we can find a way to totally delink the two? Or do you think that what we really need to do is find room where the more there are economic opportunities outside of the public space, the less these identity issues matter, where there isn't competition, and that is sufficient?
Both can be pursued. Both can be pursued simultaneously. But one of the things I've tried to do in the book is to highlight contradictions, because I believe in logical consistency. So if you say that you want to have a political economy or a matrix of citizenship that is governed by an indigenous settler divide or an indigenous settler apartheid, because that's really what it is, then you must at least be consistent. If you back up a bit, we go back to the idea that the reason these divides even matter in the first place is that we made identity the key of access to social and economic opportunity, access to the national cake. The national cake refers very specifically to oil rents, right? The national cake does not refer to gold or tin or uranium. It refers very specifically to oil rents. Now, here's my dilemma. If rents or revenues from a resource in one part of the country can go around for everybody to share, how is it that somebody from that part of the country, when it is time to engage in the sharing, is suddenly locked out of the room? I think there's a contradiction there. I think if you say that there is freedom of movement for capital, there should be freedom of movement for labor. And when the person goes there in the interest of national unity, investing his time, his skills, and all of that, when he's done and it is time to get employment in that place, you remind him that he's a non-indigenous and he does not belong. I think that these are ridiculous contradictions. So, I mean, if we are to put it through this, either you want to be one country or you don't want to be one country. But if you want to be one country, these are the contradictions involved. I believe that common citizenship is essential to this. What we've done is that we've tried to make ethnicity almost like a litmus test of citizenship, of granting civic rights, you know. So the effect that has had is that you have half citizens, quarter citizens everywhere, but no full citizens. You can't complain that people have no stake in the country when through every state policy that exists, you have told them that you don't really belong here. So people are constantly looking for where to belong. Another way in which that has really worked public policy is that we've pursued a policy of state creation that continues to look for more and more tribalized ghettos of inbreeding. So you keep creating smaller and narrower units where people that are increasingly the same can cohabit. But the problem with identity politics is, and in the way we do it, is that it is a slippery slope. So the moment you make identity something, the fact that identity itself is artificial means that that is a bottomless pit. So at the last national conference, for example, there was a proposal for an additional creation of additional states that would have brought the total to about 57 or so. But that is the point, is that once you start creating and you're telling people that you can only be safe in your own space, that you can only have full citizenship rights in your own native space, it's almost the worst form of nativism possible, then you are going to keep having this binary fission that keeps happening. That is, the division never stops. So if you create an upper state out of Benin, you're going to have an agitation for something else from somewhere else. Take Delta out of Bendel and you think you are doing fine, then suddenly Anyama people get up and say, no, we don't want to be here, you know. And so on and so forth. It keeps, we keep going down that drain. So that's how I see. Sorry, because you asked about economics. Yes. I think that diversity is absolutely critical to economic growth. I think that the more diverse your social pool is, the greater your potential for economic growth. I think that some of the poorest places are, in addition to all their other problems, simply not diverse enough. And I think that we should look outside a bit more and not simply say that Canada is engaging in a humanitarian gesture by allowing so many of us to come here. I think that you will find that many societies understand diversity to be a critical tool for driving economic growth and social engineering. I think we also have to think of it in that way.
On ethnicity, three related concepts: ethnic awareness, ethnocentrism, and ethnic chauvinism. You're ethnically aware of the kind of food you eat. You always dress like a Yoruba or Igbo man, you're ethnocentric. You use ethnicity to determine what you will get. If it's not my problem, that's ethnic chauvinism. That's where our problem is. His dressing is not a problem to me. But where people who dress like this ensure that so-and-so happens to other people, that's where you're talking about ethnic chauvinism. So that's where the problem is. And I thought I should touch on that. The comment he made about ethnicity being a social construct. Perhaps you may want to explore it for that. There might be an ontological element. It's a scientific fact that you can find within certain ethnic groups characteristics that can be established to condition certain aspects of them, that make certain food items not good for them, that predispose black people, for instance, to prostate cancer more than Aryans. So that analysis you may discover there's an ontological element. It may not drive the politics, but it needs to be understood as a phenomenon in itself and it exists. Then he spoke about integration before the coming of the white man. I think we might need to distinguish between interaction and integration. There was interaction, most of it driven by commerce, and where conflicts arose is because in the West, when cola nut traders wanted to start farming, they began to quarrel. In Opobo area, when the fishermen wanted to start also producing nets, quarrel began. So they promised, oh it is?
Thank you very much.
That's my case.
It was back to history. A comment. The caliphate is 215 years old today. So when you say city-states are 150 years, I say no. The caliphate is 215 years old today. Take it for whatever ramification, for whatever reason. But the ethnic thing, the identity thing, that I won't go to ethnicity, the identity issue is you have a people that have come together and identify certain commonalities among themselves. And these commonalities, no matter which part of the world you are, the Fulani man that goes to Texas to have a child, the Fulani man that has a child in Texas, the Fulani woman that goes to England to have a child, those characteristics cannot be taken away from being that Fulani person. And then again, when we look at identity, we begin to, this last election in particular, and I think that's something that we really need to work on. Even before people like me left here for Zaria to vote, I went to Zaria to vote. That's what I tell people. I go home to vote because if ever there's a need for me to change the governor, I should be part of that. But even before I left here, people out there had made up their mind. This election up there was more of a referendum of sorts. It was about the presidential was about a man. It wasn't about a party. And even before we left our discourse, we were saying about 7 or so governors are going to be losing out because we can feel the pulse of their people. And that's what's going on now.
But before you see, can you tell us your name and where you're from?
My name is Safia Mohammed Adamu. I'm from Zaria. I'm from Zaria.
Point of transiting from whatever we were primordially into a modern city-state, a decision was made to build what he considered two factors that were incompatible, one on top of the other. So we decided that we were going to build our modern civil state. We called the first public the civil public, the second one the primordial public. And just as she mentioned Zaria first, then she said Zaria City, I thought, she thought it was important that we know, we're not talking of this civic space called Zaria. It's this smaller space with the word called Zaria City. And I just thought that you might want to look at that article and explore that. It speaks a lot more specifically to the arrangements within government and how it is that we have the emergence of a certain psyche. There was another hand here.
All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Emeka Ngwodo, and I'm from Nigeria.
Sorry, can everyone hear him on this side? Okay, they can.
I just have a quick question for the author. By the way, congratulations is a subject matter that needs to be addressed. I want to find out from you, and I'm not trying to impose a very strict social scientific methodology on your work, but how do you perceive the independent variable, the dependent variable? What is your causal chain? Is it the state that's causing the problem, economics, or ethnicity? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am?
My name is Helen Zugwai HMB. My father is from Benue, my mother is from Kaduna.
Okay.
So,
we know your parents now as well.
Yes.
Are they fine?
I just wanted you to know that.
All right. All right.
There's a very strong link between a broad sense of self, collaboration between communities, adopting the same language, and then leading to economic growth. And you said that identity is artificial, but that it is artificial, is that not an opportunity to use it very deliberately for Nigeria to develop a broad sense of self, which will eventually take us to economic complexity and growth?
So Chris, the two questions. First, and then next question.
This is an important question. In my mind, I do not see a chain. What I see is a cycle. It's like a feedback. So on one hand, you have civil society. On the other hand, you have the state. Within the civil society sphere, you have all these currents, the currents of identity that we've talked about, the ethnicity, religion, etc., etc. Then you have the state in the way that it has been configured. And I think that both sort of, influence each other. To me, the relationship is not that of a causal chain as such. It might have been at some point, but I think right now it's more of a cyclical, mutually reinforcing. We have mutually reinforcing spheres. So to give an example of that, in the way these things play out in society, politics, which is statecraft, management of the state, etc., is essentially transactional in the sense that what a politician does is that he comes, asks 10 people what they want, and finds the golden mean, and maybe if he can arrive at satisfying 8 people, he's fine. He considers his job done. In that sense, as an aside, I don't think that politics is necessarily the first place you look for transformative energies in a society, because a politician's craft is essentially to read the pulse and give a response that approximates the golden mean. However, if a politician in Nigeria looks at what people are demanding, one of the strongest demands in Nigeria is always along the lines of representation, the desire for representation and all of that. I always, in my public engagement, distinguish between what we complain about and what we actually demand. So Nigerians may complain, in my view, we may complain about insecurity, but when it comes to demanding, the strongest demand regarding security, you may find, is lack of representation of certain groups in the National Security Council. So we may complain about insecurity, but when it is time to make a demand, we may hear something like, there aren't enough Christians in the National Security Council, or there aren't enough Southerners in the National Security Council. That argument is a very specific type of argument, not often made, but rarely made with any reference to insecurity itself. Now a politician looks at that and he thinks to himself, which is easier? And I have to say, if you're being realistic from a politician point of view in Nigeria, it's easier to put a Christian in the Security Council than it is to invest time, hard work, effort, and resources to secure the country. So that is actually easier to give. So we get that, then we move on to the next crisis, but insecurity has not gone away. So I think that there's a way. I don't quite see it so much as a causal chain. I see it as, mutually reinforcing spheres. And I think that both have to be engaged. I know I keep saying both, it's also because I'm an anti-binary type of person. I don't believe in either or. I think if there are two problems, you can often attack both at the same time. And so I think that things need to happen in civil society, things need to happen in the state as far as state policy is concerned. I think that part of one of the slides I asked, are we really polarized or are we just poor? And I think it's a question worthy of interrogation. I think that, I would say, first, in every plural society, there is prejudice. Whatever you call it, whether it's racism or chauvinism of whatever kind, that comes with diversity. That is a byproduct of managing diversity. You have different people, they get together, the idiosyncrasies of each component group. There's a way in which there's friction, there's tension, and then we get, somehow try and find an equilibrium. I think that happens in every society. Where Nigeria has gone off on a tangent is to take prejudice and make it a driver of state policy. That's my argument. So I would say that if the economy was better, I would say that you would find tensions significantly lower. But there would still be residual prejudice, the sort of prejudice that comes about just normally by having different people meet in a room, or just engaging in a common space. So I think that economics is a big part. As I said earlier, I think that some of the things we call ethnic conflicts or other types of identity conflicts are at their core distributional conflicts or actually resource conflicts, and then we just festoon them with identity labels because that is also easier to explain and understand. So that's my answer to that. Then the lady from Zaria asked, made a comment, and I don't know, do you live in Abuja?
Yes.
You live in Abuja? Okay, fine. So one of the byproducts of our system is the phenomenon of dislocated citizenship, where it's not quite clear to me why if you live in Lagos you have to travel to Anambra. Okay, I take that back. It is clear to me. I'm saying that is the problem. That's the problem. But it is problematic that if you live somewhere, you live where you live, you're paying taxes there, this is where your children are going to school, and you travel thousands of kilometers to the north, to the east, because you are vested in who is governor of that place, right? And while I understand that it is normal now, I want to state that it's also profoundly abnormal if we are thinking of it in a certain way. When we say that politics is local, we also mean that the things that affect you and the things that inform your political decision making are local factors. So where I am, my primary concern cannot be who is governor of Plateau State, or who is governor of Delta, or who is governor of wherever. My concern is right in front of me. Who is getting the refuse, the garbage off my streets? Who will ensure that I am safe, that my children are safe? The quality of schools that my children are attending? Who is dealing with them? Those kinds of very immediate concerns are what politics is about. And I think that one of the dysfunctions we suffer from is that we evade that immediate sphere of local responsibility to travel to go and fight an identity conflict by other means during an election season, and then come back and continue to marinate in substandard conditions. So I think that there's just something wrong. That dislocated citizenship is part of the problem. Because of the incident that partly inspired this, I'll say, for example, that once you are paying taxes in a place, the question of where you come from is irrelevant, completely inconsequential. You are a shareholder in that place. You are not going to collect my money, nor ask for the ethnic origin of my money, or the state of origin of my money, and then suddenly start trying to delegitimize my right to engage as a political actor where I live. And I think that that is something we should push back against. The moment you get into taxation, and I believe that as we move along and we discover that our country is facing a revenue crisis and it is being forced to diversify its revenue channels and taxes are becoming more important, we will find that one of the drivers of conflict will become the idea of taxation without representation. Because in a lot of states in this country, the states that we like to refer to as civil service states, right? The entrepreneurial class, the working classes largely belong to people who we consider non-indigenous or settlers. I do not see how you can sustain that apartheid while at the same time asking them to submit taxes as part of a social contract that clearly does not exist. So maybe we are on the path to engaging those questions of taxation without representation. And that will probably lead us to concrete solutions about this idea of dislocated citizenship.
And then the question of the emergence of language. If it is artificially, if it is an artificial construct, does it then not provide us an opportunity to think forward and build sort of a larger level of an identity with its own language that will bind us? Am I correct?
Yes, so in countries with broader senses of self, let's take the United States, where if you're born in Texas, you're a Texan. They deliberately created that identity of being an American. If a child lives in the US for the first 5 years of their life, for the rest of their life they consider themselves American. They did it deliberately. Is that not an opportunity that exists for us?
That is necessary. I don't think that is absolutely necessary. I do not think that linguistic differences, in fact, are at the roots of our problems. If you look at the way this country has evolved over 100 years, you will find that as more urban spaces grow, as urbanization proceeds, ethnically homogeneous spaces are also shrinking. So where my grandfather, the world to my grandfather ended at the horizon of his village, right? My son lives in a globalized environment. We live in a globalized environment where our borders have expanded. So the idea is that the human person, you as a person, your consciousness of what the world means, of where the world ends, is actually growing. So I think that you will find that among many Nigerians of the post-Civil War generation, for example, you will find that you're dealing with Nigerians that are in many cases multilingual. You will find that we've created languages that can break barriers. It may not seem like it, but Hausa is actually one. Pidgin English is actually one. There's an argument to be made that Hausa is to the north what Pidgin English is to the south. It's a language that crosses barriers. Hausa is spoken by more people outside of the ethnicity, the originating ethnicity, than any other language in Nigeria. Pidgin English simply cuts across. And these are things that the spread of the language, the dynamics of the language have to do with the spread of trade, the intermingling of people. So, yes, I agree with your position.
So next, and sort of the central role that we seem to think tax can play in the emergence of or the strengthening of an already existing social contract between an individual, a citizen as an individual, because tax is not community-based. You collect tax, the state receives tax from people as individuals. In contradistinction, what you mentioned much earlier is how really it appears as if the challenges around what seems to be identity are really a question of a distributional state. So my question is, if we simply ignore all the questions around managing identity, changing the laws around citizenship, and instead focus on moving away from a rent economy where government distributes, and government that gets replaced with a government that seeks to create individual economic citizens, and government generates the resources it will use to provide public services to citizens from tax. Will that be sort of another way to go? That we would then, to just rephrase, will that be the basis of an emergence of a place where the differences exist, but will be less competitive because everyone is having a personal relationship with the state negotiated by the attacks. And as such, maybe that would be a good place to begin the conversation and begin the focus, not necessarily on looking at just identity and citizenship and how that is managed.
Yes, another round of questions.
In his presentation, he pampered the reality of the polarization of our nation. And if you ask me, why do we record loss of lives during the elections? Secondly, why do we have anxiety of fear instead of anxiety of excitement during election, post-election as well?
Okay. Based on my your name,
the topic for today, because I want to look forward. So if I were to reframe it, I would say managing identity in a pre-election Nigeria ahead for 2023. And given your definition of what social construct means, I would want to not exactly agree with the trying to reframe. Okay, so I think I understood you saying that it was the colonial masters that actually defined the social construct that we have right now. But I think because social reality is dynamic, I think the groups and individuals in Nigeria currently actually have framed it over a period of time. So looking forward to 2023, how do you think, what's the actionable roadmap that you think that would help Nigerians to begin to identify themselves as one, not just by religion, by ethnicity, or by some other identities, to help us address some of the issues that we experienced for 2019? Thank you.
The real question, so during election time, we are not being abnormal. We amplify certain negative traits about our society, but we're not being abnormal. I'll tell you that one incident of violence in Zamfara, if you put the two elections we've had, states and national, we've not equaled the body count of one incident in Zamfara. The country is violent, the country is insecure. Fundamentally, it is, right? So I tried to get out of the idea of the election cycle being a very unique indicator of something. I'm not sure it is. I think what we're looking at is the distinction between structural violence or objective violence and subjective violence. Objective violence refers to the structural factors that induce violence. They are always there. Subjective violence is the actual episode of violence itself. What we do is we wait for the actual episode of violence, and then we start writing reams of articles, right? But the objective violence is the more problematic thing because it exists there. So for example, if you discriminate between your citizens, if you create apartheid between your citizens, you will have violence. It's as simple as that. If you make identity the key of access to opportunity, you will have violence. All the more so if you are a poor country with increasingly diminishing opportunities, right? So I don't think that election cycles are, I don't think there's any specific, I mean, we can protect voters, we can do some of that, but as long as the country remains fundamentally violent, as long as the political economy retains those factors that generate violence, you will have it one way or the other. So I don't think the election cycle is a good place to look at in terms of violence. I don't even think it has necessarily anything to do with ethnicity, which comes to your, so I'm going to come to your own question now. Why do we record loss of life during elections? There's a separate answer to that, and I would say that because of the outsized and disproportionate rewards for holding public office in a poor country, what we've created is a climate in which the types of people that seek office are not necessarily the types of people you want around you. I would say that because the rewards for holding public office are so outsized and so disproportionate to the general income level, we've incentivized violence in our politics. The stakes are too high. If you meet the British Prime Minister, he'll give you a handshake, pin a rose on your lapel maybe, and that's it. If you meet a local government chairman in Nigeria, it will alter generations of your family. That is abnormal. It is, so you are inducing a certain type of political competition that is conducive for psychopaths and sociopaths. If you look at the outlay required to seek office, people that make honest money shy away from it because they realize that the return on that investment is abnormal, so abnormal as to be criminal. So they leave it, they don't. That's one of the problems we have. So I don't think ethnicity is necessarily the issue here. I would say to you, for example, that so we have an election now where two Fulani Muslim northerners ran against each other. They were major candidates. And we structured elections in that way because this is how we try to ensure against violence. Yet people died. Yet people that were neither Fulani nor Muslim were targeted. So it seems that whatever you do, it seems like even if you brought Icelanders to contest in an election, Nigerians would still die in that election, right? So I think that there's a separate problem there. Where ethnicity comes in, however, is that if you look at our history, inter-ethnic transitions of power have always been bloodier, whether military or civilian. The bloodless coups tended to be people of the same, roughly the same region, if not the same ethnicity, taking power from each other, right? So the coup that brought General Buhari into office, or the coup that overthrew Shagari, the coup that overthrew Buhari, perpetrated by members of broadly the same constituency, whether it is the professional as in the military or regional or religious, they tend to be generally bloodless. The bloodiest military interventions, whether abortive or successful, have been the ones where members of one group try to come in to seize power from the other. Now, if you take civilian transitions, the same dynamic repeats itself. So compare 2011 to maybe some other elections that we've had, and you will see that where you might have a southern Christian running against a northern Muslim, the violence is ramped up. Why? Because of what? It is perceived. What is perceived is not two people contesting against themselves, it is two communities or constituencies contesting against each other. So in that way, we've made our election very existential. And we've made elections look like low-intensity civil conflict. If you think about it, even the movement of hardware and all of that, and the body count that we have, you know, the casualties we sustain. So I don't think that ethnicity is the issue there. I don't think that the election is an index of ethnic polarization. Maybe we are polarized, but that is not why elections are necessarily bloody. I'm saying that by themselves, the way we structure political office, the way we reward political office, can only incentivize violence. What can we do to change that? You have to strip public office of the outsized and abnormal rewards, the discretionary latitude over public resources and law enforcement assets that make holding office turn a Nigerian into a god among mortals, right? That is how you begin to solve that particular problem. Identity-related issues require a specific set of engagement, but for electoral violence, in my view, this is the issue. And then you asked about taxes and all of that. I agree. I think that if the government was sustained by taxes rather than oil rents, first of all, we would have a more responsive government. Because what happens is, in a Nigerian situation, a government sustained by taxes is a government sustained by people. If I am running a municipality and my administration is sustained by taxes, it means that my people, the citizens in my jurisdiction, have to be alive for me to get taxes. Our well-being, my well-being and theirs is organically connected. But if I am sustained by oil rents, a disaster can wipe out 40% of that population, and I will not flinch because it makes no difference to my well-being. In fact, potentially it might be more money because dead people don't demand, you know, services. So I think that there is a way in which a government that is entirely extractive, entirely rooted in, you know, sustenance, entirely rooted in crude oil revenues, is inhumane. Forget about being dysfunctional. It is inhumane. And I think that to humanize government, we must begin to talk about the things you're talking about. At the moment, what happens and what has paralyzed our policies is that the conversations we're having at the state level or at any level are really debates about patronage. Nobody is demanding for social services. People are demanding patronage because that is the dynamic of a government or governance that is funded by oil rents. But I'll go so far as to say that there's actually no governance going on. There's very little actual governance going on. What passes for governance in this country is conducted largely by CSOs, foreign and local CSOs. So for example, you are rarely going to find a politician whose problem, who wakes up at night thinking about water resource scarcity or water insecurity in his community. But you will find a CSO that its entire mandate is to provide water for those people. So what I'm saying to you is that our political economy completely disincentivizes any interest in government, in governance as a craft. So I believe that if we were engaged in taxation and government depended on the people, the complexion of government would change. The reaction of government to things affecting citizens would change. It would be completely different. But this is the dynamic that we are in.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Fasho. I'm a Nigerian like everyone else. I'll just read it out, so I'll stay within the minutes. Number one, I'm worried about Chris's take on a violent country. I'm wondering, I would like you to explain, is it developmental or is it genetic? Number two, or is it our start somewhere? Have we done enough work on understanding global history before complaining about our current reality, given that Ireland was the first country colonized by the Brits, and also Australia was a colony for criminals. And lastly, every nation is a geographical expression, according to Count von Metternich, 1747, before it was repeated by Ngwodo 200 years later. Is tribalism weaponized, would you say, or weaponized and counter-weaponized in Nigeria, and which way forward? Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat the last question?
Yes, would you agree that tribalism, the tribe thing, has been weaponized in Nigeria? Meaning that there are real consequences in terms of people deploying it for, undue advantage, which is perhaps holding the country back in several respects, and also being counter-weaponized, like what's going on in Lagos between Yorubas and Igbo.
Some people assumption of the notion of state. I have an issue with that. Because you get an example of France and others, Australia and the rest of them, where I know there are some commonalities that define a state, like Israel. Descent, history, geography. Geography is important. You didn't, in your work, you needed to define what you understand, what nation means, and what the nation state is. I didn't hear you say that. Secondly, the issue of the character of the Nigerian state, which is at the root of what we are seeing today, you glossed over it. The role of the post-colonial state, you didn't tell us about that, because it has a way it has affected us. It's still, subjugating us to today. We need to come out of that. Thirdly, ethnicity and identity. Which one is larger? Because you used the two almost interchangeably. Because if you remember the ethnic politics by Professor Nole and the rest of them, who is a very great scholar in that area, I want to believe that what you're discussing is actually ethnicity in the larger context.
Please, I got a bit worried and confused when you said Nigerian politicians are not tribalistic, but cynical. I don't want to take that take seriously.
Sorry, I haven't said it.
And though you said it, I quoted yes. You said it, but said it. So my yes, the record yes, because going by memory lane on our political formations in this country, particularly from the Second Republic, where we have 5 political parties that were regionally based. Then from there to do 2 parties, SDP, NRC, the 2 parties were actually a kind of a harmonization of the Second Republic political parties. Then going further to to, that's after the table then, to these other ones that, I mean, to get to where we are today, you see, discover that some of the political parties and politicians still stand on that existing, yes, ethnic based political system. So my main question, please, yes, is there no way, or are there ways, either politically, legally, administratively, or by way of policy formulations, rules, regulations, that even the government itself that has institutionalized tribalism can address this issue? For example, admission into colleges, into universities are based on either quota system, catchment area, recruitment, the same thing. You have to state where you belong to. And you know, some of us, well, as a woman, as a married woman, you even get confused at time, where do I claim? My father's place, my mother's place, my husband's place. So, so that is a big question, please. So if either constitutionally, this issue can be addressed, or legally or administratively, because the government itself is a contributor to this, and our politicians also help to facilitate and encourage political violence through identity politics.
What I meant is this. I juxtaposed something called positive tribalism versus any other thing, equal opportunity meritocracy. That's actually what is on the slide. Right? Now, positive tribalism, if tribalism was simply the problem, this is how I think of it. If tribalism was simply the problem, if we elect a leader on the assumption that he's going to take care of his place, his community, and his people, I submit to you that Nigeria would look a lot better than it does now. We would go to places and find places that are good places because we understand that the leaders took public resources and over-invested in those places, invested in transforming those places. That's an example of positive tribalism. That is what it would look like. But we know that that is not true. So the discussion about tribal or ethnic representation is a proxy for something else. It's a proxy for a conflict over access to patronage, who can control the machinery of patronage and access to it. So frequently you find, so if you say, for example, Northerners have dominated Nigeria's politics, right? And it can even cause bragging rights. You can say Katsina has produced 3 or 2, you know, Kano has produced 2. One of the quirks of Nigerian rhetoric is how we use industrial metaphors when we are distinctly not industrial. So you say Kano is producing, or Katsina is producing, or Bayelsa is producing. There's no production going on there, you know. So we are using funny metaphors to describe patronage, right? Katsina would look great. Kano would look better. Human development indices in all those places would be stratospheric. It is not. Why is that? So it makes this debate fraudulent at some level because we are arguing, the debate is proceeding on 2 levels. These people are talking about something, but they are really talking about something else. And you have bought into what you think they are talking about, and we've run with it. So the debate in civil society is a fraudulent one, driven by the agenda that political elites use. So in one sense, we could simply say that what I've been discussing or describing as tribalism is simply our own localized form of populism. How do you mobilize people? How do you get people going? So to be able to politically mobilize people in this country, you have to go native. You have to show that you are for them, that you are looking out for them, and that what that means is that you're trying to get federal resources down. And we hear it all the time. It's perfectly normal in our politics to say, for example, that a state would be much better off if it voted for the ruling party at the center, so that there is a sync with the center. You know, I think if you visit Lagos now, you have to seriously question the logic of that argument. You know? So it's a way in which. So when I say that Nigerian politicians are not tribalistic, what I mean is this: rarely will you meet a Nigerian politician that viscerally hates somebody because of his tribe. Rarely will you meet one that viscerally hates somebody because of his tribe. In many instances, I've heard politicians using tribalistic rhetoric while telling you that they have 4 wives for 4 different geopolitical zones. Right? That they don't have a... But what I'm saying to you is that Tribalistic rhetoric is simply politics. That is why I mean what I mean when I say they are cynical. They know that the quickest way to divide people and to mobilize people is to go to use certain metaphors. You have to use a certain type of language to mobilize people, right? If I was trying to mobilize the following now, and let us say this is the Nigerian space, and I'm trying to mobilize the following now, I would analyze the audience. I would look at different things. How do I appeal to these people? Do I appeal to their learning? Do I appeal to their class? Do I appeal to their religion? Do I appeal to their ethnicity? You know, which sense of self can I key in? You know that thing we call the mumu button, right? And Nigerians have a mumu button. Which one is it? Or which of the mumu buttons should I press? You know? And I'll zero in on ethnicity. But this place looks very well heeled, so I might appeal to your learning. You know? But the point is, I am being cynical. That is what it is. That Nigerian politicians are not largely tribalistic. I don't think that I don't meet politicians that hate you because you're from the Niger Delta or anything. I've met very decent people that we go out in a political campaign and start mobilizing people against other people. And they are still decent people in their homes. I think that there is a way in which our political economy, if you're not looking to change it, and if you're simply a politician who is trying to get by and survive, if you enter the public space, you quickly learn the way to talk to mobilize people. So when you come, don't start discussing econometrics, don't show graphs. Just start saying that the South has been marginalized, Igbo people are on the verge of extinction, the Middle Belt is being wiped out. The beauty of all these things is that there is truth to them. There's a fragment of truth to them. But that is easy because everywhere in this country is insecure. So it's not a call to really rational debate. It is just dog whistling that we are doing. We just want to mobilize you. So that's what I meant by that statement. I didn't mean that tribalism doesn't exist. I'm saying that we must be aware of the ways in which politicians weaponize it. Right? Stop there. I almost said congratulations.
You didn't have to go there.
Are we a violent country? There's nothing genetic about our problems. I flee from anything that tries to geneticize problems. That's quite racist. I don't believe there's anything genetic about this. But violence is a social phenomenon. It's not a spiritual phenomenon, so it's not cosmic. If you have certain indices in a place, certain active variables in a place, you will have violence. If you take a conflict map, if you do a mapping of conflict, and you look at ghetto, so for example, I'll say to you that, as someone that lives in the north, urban violence is very specific, it's rooted in specific places. So for example, if you live in Lagos and you see a newspaper that says, just burns or just in flames, be assured that you could actually be in just, most times I don't know when those things happen, right? This is very localized violence. So you zero in on specific places that consistently are theaters of that violence. You will find that there are indices that they have that are constant. These are places that are densely populated. These are places that have a huge proportion of unschooled and unskilled young males between the ages of 14 and 35, where there is almost zero presence of social services, almost zero presence of state law enforcement of any kind. Those places, among other indices, you will find that those places are more prone to conflict. What that also means is that conflict, if violence can be anticipated, then it can be mitigated, it can be prevented. That is what it means, right? So I'm not saying, when I say Nigeria is a violent country, I'm not saying that there's something wrong with us genetically. I'm saying that given all the factors in our society, that there are factors that raise the likelihood of violence in any given space. And I've outlined some of those factors as they relate to identity issues. Is tribalism weaponized in Nigeria? Absolutely, yes. I need to make it, I think Dr. Oke made that distinction, but it's worth saying, I'm not saying that there's something wrong with ethnicity, right? I'm not saying that belonging to a given ethnic group is wrong or immoral or anything. I am talking about the management of diversity, the management of inter-ethnic relations, inter-religious relations in a diverse society, I'm saying that the way we construct ethnicity has made it much more than ethnicity. Ethnicity is social security in Nigeria. There is too much riding on it. That's why a conflict between two people becomes an inter-ethnic conflict, right? Or an altercation between two people turns into a crisis that levels a town, right? That is because of the way we've constructed ethnicity. There's nothing wrong with being an ethnically conscious person or coming from somewhere. All of us come from somewhere. Lastly, educate.
Yes.
Your question is to be continued. The character of the Nigerian state, the role of the post-colonial states, identity and ethnicity, which is larger. I know that I've used them in ways that suggest that they are synonymous. It's just for the purposes of this conversation. Okay. There is identity, obviously. Ethnicity is a subset of identity. Class is a subset of identity. Religion is a subset of identity. Yes, gender is a subset of identity. So there are different ways in which people self-define and in which communities self-define that, represent the various manifestations of identity. So the book deals primarily with ethnicity. It talks a bit about religion, but that's a subject for another book. Okay. It talks largely about ethnicity because ethnicity is the one I think that we have mystified most. And the best way I can describe this book to you is that it's really set out to demystify identity. To bring it down from the pedestal that we've placed it on, and to see it as something that is normal, to see that these are issues that afflict other societies. The difference is that here we use a very toxic version of identity politics to inform state policy. You talked about the character of the Nigerian state and the role of the post-colonial state. I think I've addressed that a bit. One can't be going in depth into this, but when we talk about the Nigerian state being a criminal enterprise, that is because it is based on predation and extraction, right? It's not really, the Nigerian state's actions are not, I would say, frequently governed or guided by the consents of the government, right? But there is, again, nothing unique about that. As I argue, all states emerge as criminal enterprises. Over time, at some point in history, the elites of the states begin to legitimize the state. That is why things like the social contract emerge. So we need to talk in terms of the social covenant for Nigeria that makes them partakers and shareholders in this state. And then we need to talk about an elite consensus as well in terms of what this country means, what a Nigerian citizen can reasonably expect for being a Nigerian citizen. That's what I mean.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, for those raising their hands, we'll stop now because we invited you here for 2 hours and there's 5 more minutes. And it remains for me to say firstly, thanks for enduring the heat and still keeping the conversation going. Now, 2 thoughts from me before I call Ndi. One is there are so many other questions that this has sort of gotten us thinking along. And if you're living here a bit unsettled, I feel like our job has been done. But then there's an immediate solution: buy the book. And you would be able to find deeper explorations and conversations around the issues that Chris has highlighted and we've attempted to have a conversation about. I have a bunch of questions that I intend to carry on with Chris and ask for. One of which is, for example, I thought a huge part of your recommendations was on elite bargaining. And I'm wondering, but the elite already is benefiting, so why should they change what is good for them? If the elite is part of the problem and the solution is elite bargaining and the elite thinking, what do we do? And then, again, a lot of other questions. The second thought is, Patrick started when we had the projector by showing us the website roadmapnigeria.org, where this conversation will continue online. Every resource from previous discourses are being uploaded. This will be uploaded as well. And there is a facility on that website for a forum that you can actually go on and ask and throw in these questions. And there would be others that you can engage. Now, in the short to medium term, and within the next 2 months, like you said, our intention is to collect the thoughts coming in from you when you go online, as well as those that we have collected here, and interact a little more with Chris and other scholars, and thereafter provide some kind of position or options paper or communique that we can push forward to the decision makers in the country, so that they can consider. We think it's very critical that we do it now, because we're within a transition period. So an incoming government will have one more thing to consider. I will end with a quote out of the book on page 215. Chris says, "History teaches that belonging to the same ethnic stock or re-engineering ethnically homogeneous states cannot indemnify the society against conflict. The Hutus and Tutsis of Rwanda speak the same language and are overwhelmingly Christian. Somalia, the world's poster child of failed statehood, has only one ethnicity, the Somali, and one religion, Sunni Islam, within its borders. Its transgenerational civil war features an assortment of clans, warlords, and pirates. South Sudan, which only recently celebrated its divorce from Sudan, is now embroiled in inter-ethnic conflict within its borders. In Nigeria itself, we need only to look at ethnically homogeneous states to establish conclusively that cultural homogeneity is not a predictor of peace, social justice, or smart governance. So our diversity and heterogeneity is not our challenge. Managing it in the right way is. And I hope that this conversation has stirred in us some way that will begin to move in that right direction. Thank you, everyone.
Give these two men a rousing applause. First, I will start from the one which is obvious. I want to apologize for the scuffness of this place. It's not in the character of Nextier to go for the list. Probably one will go outside, some of us will see what happens. But we are a firm that believes that good is not enough where better is possible. So we sincerely apologize for this. And again, I want to thank everyone for coming to this month's government discourse. Like Mayor just said now, and as Patrick did said when he started, this is something we want to keep doing every month. And we're not just bringing anybody, we're bringing people who we know will contribute, quality people who know will contribute to this discourse. There's some people I'm seeing, I only read about them, I'm just seeing them, I don't know how Patrick brought them. But it shows what we're trying to do. We want people who will come here, before you sit here to present, you know, it's like going for a BBC hard talk. There will be hard questions for you to answer. So I'm not going to reveal what we are planning for April, so that we keep people guessing. I want to thank Chris for coming, and then Maya for the questions. And I know the questions were hard topics, or you were up to the task with everything. And probably you shout your email so that some people will post some of the questions to you. So let the conversation continue. And again, I know that each and one of us, we are living here with a shift in our idea, either the positive or the negative, depending on how you think about it. But for me, I know for one thing, you know, for ethnic politics to stop in Nigeria, our high-stake politics must stop. In as much as being a local government chairman will clear all the poverty in my generation, well, people will continue to kill to get into that place. So, as Chris did suggest as well, once we are able to redefine our politics in such a way that people run for office because they want to serve, not because they want to get, be rich, this will continue. And again, I want to thank everybody again for coming. And I'm sure we're all happy living here. And thank you for coming. And I think Patrick has
just one quick comment. And then secondly, to say that we were initially thinking that these dialogues would be every month, but it seems that the issues that we need to engage are way more than 12. So we've decided to host another one in 2 weeks' time. And it's going to be on the subject, or we'll try to explore the role of protectionism and trade policy in Nigeria's economic development. Reason being that some of our trading partners are beginning to move into Nigeria, and people are getting unemployed and so on and so forth. But we'll explore how to respond to the imbalance in our trade policy. We'll send out the notice, and if you can, please join us as we continue this session. And on that note, permit me to say thank you.